don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Jack Despain Zhou, who, along with a collaborator named Lillian Tara, have launched a new think tank centered on orienting education towards a culture of excellence. Some of the things that came up in this conversation that I thought were interesting were some of the tensions between a more traditional sort of direct instruction kind of approach and a more progressive education, and some of the ways that the vision that Jack is advocating for includes some elements from both ends of that spectrum. So we talked about some of those tensions and got into some of the usual themes that we talk about here on the podcast regularly of direct instruction versus inquiry, and some of the evidence for those kinds of things and ways forward in his mind. I also pressed him a little bit on some of the challenges that he may face with being a new think tank and his inexperience and, quite frankly, his youth, and we talked a bit about that. No doubt there's lots of reasons for improvement in our educational system, and it's interesting to hear a new voice and perhaps one from outside of education, although that's not particularly novel, and we discussed that as well. As always, I encourage you to visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, if you are interested in our professional development services, which is always through the lens of inquiry, but certainly with a nod towards cognitive science and some of those things that are evidence-based in terms of building knowledge. Among the services that we offer there are project-based learning, differentiated instruction, and knowledge-rich inquiry teaching. I'd also like to remind you, if you're interested in project-based learning, we are in early bird registration for our PBL Grow 25 summer conference event here in Louisville, Kentucky. That'll be in June. You can find that if you click the very top of our website, which is, again, wegrowteachers.com. I also want to mention that I'm looking forward to having more collaborative conversations that are reflective, similar to the one that I hosted around cognitive load theory, and that was very popular. We've got some coming up on dichotomous thinking and the science of dialogue. I'm planning one on DEI without divisiveness, and we've got some others in the works as well. If you're interested in conversations like that, you can always reach out to me. My email is drew@thoughtstretchers.org. I'd love to hear your comments, thoughts, ideas, or concerns about that, this podcast, our work, or any other things. And now, without further ado, here is my conversation with Jack. I am here with Jack Despain Zhou, and I think I got that pronounced correctly. Some folks would know him as Tracing Wood Greens from his association with Blocked and Reported. And if you're not familiar with that podcast, it's a fun and entertaining but informative podcast on internet excesses. But he's also, if you follow him on the X, he talks and tweets or whatever we do now, a lot about education matters, which obviously is what we're here to talk about. He's got a new project that is called the Center for Educational Progress, and I'm going to give him an opportunity to introduce himself and give a little background on Jack, on who you are, so folks know a little bit more about you and maybe unpack kind of the main ideas behind the Center for Educational Progress before we get into the meat of the conversation.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So a little bit about my background. I grew up in Utah, and during that time, as a student, I was always looking for something beyond what my schools were offering me. This was in kindergarten, in elementary school, junior high, high school. Every time I was feeling like it was a little bit too slow, a little bit too unfocused. And so from a very, very young age, I was looking around like trying, can I do online school? Will that be faster? Will that be more effective? Can I try this charter school? Will that be more effective? Can I skip a grade? Will that be more effective? Can I basically just every point of the way stress testing my education experience and saying, something isn't working here. What isn't working? What isn't working? And all of that really spurred my interest in education and basically trying to understand where and how I felt like it wasn't working. Since then, I have gone on, I was in the military for 6 years as a language analyst, And then I stepped away to go to law school with a goal to focus on education policy and focus on the questions of how and where I could focus on the problems that I see in education. In particular, one of the things that has struck me in recent years, one of the questions that I had that spurred this whole project is, why in education policy do people keep tearing gifted programs down? And why do people keep tearing selective schools down? Why is the war right now between basically the status quo and what I would consider backsliding? So, for example, you had a major feud in San Francisco and in California at large over, should we teach algebra in 8th grade or should we delay it until 9th grade? And you have detracking conversations in a lot of different places. You have places like Seattle that are saying we're getting rid of our gifted programs, and you have places like Lowell High School, with its selective schools, Thomas Jefferson, where you have large cohorts of people looking to change admission processes for selective schools or tear selective schools down, things like that. And so my interest in a policy direction really came in saying, why is there such a concerted push to attack these things? And why is there nowhere near as much of a concerted push to look and say, how can we help more people go further faster? What are the specific mechanisms towards excellence in education? What are the specific mechanisms towards the development of expertise? And how can we get as many people onto that path as aggressively as possible? So, as you mentioned, I recently launched the Center for Educational Progress, and its goal is essentially to answer those questions, to look and say, well, how can we shift the conversation in education from just this status quo versus what I would call weakening the status quo, things like detracking, things like trying to fight against early algebra, or things like that. Shift it from that to, what do genuine excellence-focused improvements on the status quo look like? What are policy directions that would enable us to help as many students who want to go faster and want to go further do that? What on a practical level does that look like?
Okay. And so your assertion or your, I guess, hypothesis, or whatever we might call that, is that those decisions are being made based on more ideology than empiricism. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely. Well, and I would even say, so I'm not going to claim personally that I'm non-ideological. And I'm not going to claim that really anything is non-ideological. What I would say is that people are using some empirical tools. I think that education research has a lot of flaws and a lot of fads and a lot of broken elements, but there's some empiricism in there. What I would say is that people are looking for a specific goal, and then that goal in itself is somewhat ideologically determined, and then using empiricism to judge how to reach that goal effectively. And I would say that my own goals are different to the goals of, say, progressive educators, and different as well to the goals of the libertarian choice movement that is their main, I would say, opposition in the education arena, where progressive educators are really focused on a question of basically, how can we equalize results for people? How can we close gaps? How can we, get everyone to approximately the same level in this way, or this way? How can we give or avoid further advantaging the advantage, things like that? Whereas the whole libertarian choice movement is very much focused on, how can we introduce market mechanisms to all of this? What are the best ways to introduce these market mechanisms? What are the best ways to introduce this composition, everything? And, those are both coherent goals to optimize towards, and you can optimize towards those goals with empirical results. I think that, in particular, the progressive education movement tends to disregard empirical results that go against some of its things, but I'm not saying it's entirely non-empirical. What I'm saying, rather, is that they are simply not asking the question of, say, if you have a student who is already ahead of the median, a progressive educator is never going to be asking the question, how can we get this student even further ahead? How can we push this student further, challenge them more? Does this student need more challenge? Is this student being adequately challenged? That's just not a question that comes up in that frame. And so there are a lot of blind spots like that just never enter in with that. And that's how I'd characterize it.
Yeah, well, interesting. The labels are obviously inherently subjective in some ways, and I, sometimes often will refer to myself as a progressive educator. So I would say that I don't fit that characterization, which doesn't mean that, that progressive education in general doesn't have some of those problems. So you talked about progressive education, sort of a libertarian, but what about, and is it important to include sort of a more traditional kind of approach? I mean, that's how I think about the sort of education spectrum, and actually recently wrote about it, sort of a traditional versus progressive, and there's some straw man versions of that, some of it characterized in research in ways that I think is problematic, but the sense that there's a pendulum swing back towards something that's more traditional, more direct instruction, more small d and I direct instruction, probably more than capital D and I direct instruction, but explicit instruction, things like that are sort of antithesis, at least in that argument, in that discussion, antithesis to inquiry or constructivist or progressive kinds of education. So, I mean, is it helpful, or do you not feel it's useful to think about traditional instruction or traditional views of education in that discussion?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think the traditional ones are useful. And in general, I would say if you're trying to categorize me according to that frame, I tend towards more that what would be framed as that traditionalist frame. What I would say with that is in a lot of ways, like these quote unquote traditionalists are sort of in disarray in the sense of there just aren't nearly as many of them in the policy space as there are more progressive people and more libertarian people. And I also think that framing it as traditionalism in it sort of idealizes the past in a way that I think is unproductive with it, in the sense of I think that a lot of the things that would be framed as quote unquote traditional, say something like this direct instruction stuff, would can be and should be seen as people asking, say, an empirical question of how do you get people towards the top of this skill tree as effectively as possible and coming towards that conclusion. And so I would say that it could be classed in sort of a traditionalist frame, the sort of things that I'm talking about, but it's more of a pragmatist, excellence-focused frame that I'm into. But yeah, I mean, obviously the traditionalists are real. Cohesive force is something that's worth understanding.
Yeah, and there seems to be growing traction with some voices that I would probably characterize as, some version of traditional instruction or traditional education. So Center for Educational Progress, the work that you're hoping to do, I guess, what's the vision for what you hope to see in classrooms and schools around the country?
Yeah, it's a good question. The core of the vision is really centered around a few things. First of all, and probably the largest divergence from education policy as it stands right now, is understanding how we can more effectively sort by ability over sorting by age. That is, when you're looking at a classroom and you're saying, what's the best way to sort this classroom? What is the best way to put students together? Our case would be you want to have, in general, in any subject where it's hierarchical, excellence focused, whatever, is you want to figure out what skill level are people currently at, and you want to sort people into a classroom based on that skill level and say teach them from there, as opposed to what is the overwhelming and has always been the overwhelming default in American education, which is sort by age first and then sometimes maybe sort by ability on top of that. We would say, first off, even within age bands, it is worth sorting by ability. But second off, ability is a more important and a more fundamental differentiator than age in terms of what people should be learning when. And that's our biggest and our most radical claim. Other than that, we, take science of learning seriously and to take expertise research seriously. So I would say look for these science of learning principles. Look for the things that have been demonstrated to work, things like spaced repetition, things like interleaving, these classic science of learning things, and understand where are the ways that these should be incorporated more into curricula? How can these be incorporated more effectively into curricula? Things like that. And more broadly, orienting classrooms towards a question of how can we push things towards more learning maximization. In addition, those are the main things: are ability grouping, empiricism, and focusing on a question of how to help students learn who want to progress effectively.
So, I'm thinking about the sort of dropping of the sort of age grouping, which actually a lot of progressive educators sort of use that, right? They talk about the factory model and grouping by age and how problematic that can be in the progressive education sense. I'm imagining, sort of the maximalist version of that being the one-room schoolhouse. Is it something like that you're advocating for?
It's not exactly the one-room schoolhouse, in a sense of, ideally, you would look and say, basically, well, what is the population of students we are working with, and what are the resources that we are working with, and what grouping systems can we effectively do with these resources? I would also say that I'm not going to come out and say, oh yeah, definitely you can have like 7-year-olds and 12-year-olds or 7-year-olds and 16-year-olds in the same room productively in all situations. Rather, what I'm saying at its core is push marginally towards, in any given setting, look and say, how can we group more effectively by ability? And how can we put people more effectively with people who are at the same current level with that? And how can we more effectively teach people at whatever level they are at in a subject and keep providing them meaningful challenges in that regard? So in short, shifting to rather than a default assumption of take a bunch of students with disparate abilities, put them in the same classroom, and have teachers differentiate within classroom, whatever, optimistically, we would say the simplest thing to do is try to make groupings as homogeneous as possible and to try to push curriculum towards giving these students, in any given classroom, helping them grow as much as possible from the specific point there.
Right. So, well, thanks for that clarification. Yeah, I mean, again, I think there's some overlap with some progressive educators' and vision of teaching and breaking free of some of the more traditional structures that you're referring to of, grouping by age and there's an old video of the coming off the assembly line and stamping by date of creation or something like that. I'm butchering that, but so yeah, to me it's interesting that I think there's some overlap there. Yeah. So you mentioned science of learning, cognitive science. If people, listeners of the podcast and people familiar with my work would be aware of how much I've engaged with that, those kinds of I guess thinkings and ideas, and I think they are important. As we were talking before we hit record, I recently talked with Howard Gardner, and of course he's a very progressive educator, and even he noted that there's been lots of shortcomings in the progressive education movement, but the cognitive science or science of learning sort of trademark kind of approach, how do you characterize that? You talked about interleaving, and you mentioned a few of the things that some people may say buzzwords, but when you think science of learning, what does that mean for you?
Good question. What it means for me is essentially what are the when you are taking someone who is an amateur in a subject, what are the things that will develop expertise and develop a full body of knowledge as quickly, as effectively, as thoroughly, as permanently as possible in any given domain. How do you get someone from point A of knowing nothing and being capable of nothing to point B of knowing everything and being capable of everything as quickly and as effectively as possible? So I would point to K. Anders Ericsson and his expertise research with that. Things, the things he did with deliberate practice and looking at the elements of it, the things that are effective with it. I would also point to things like Robert Bjork, his work, and looking at things like the role of interleaved education, the role of forgetting education, the direct instruction sorts. I would point to things like, Siegfried Engelmann, his work, generally phonics and reading, things like that. There's a fairly large cluster with it, but the common themes are people who are really drilling into the empirics of any given element of learning and saying, yeah, if you look at it, if you teach under these conditions, these people wind up remembering this more effectively, and concretely becoming capable of more after this than they do in other methods. Testing and psychometrics plays into it as well. I would say understanding what makes effective test, what makes an effective metric, what are the ways that you can really gauge this content knowledge appropriately, what are the elements of that. Anything that really takes an empirical, sort of ruthlessly empirical lens towards how much in a practical sense are people learning from this.
So then, where do you see, this is a conversation and a discussion that I think is really important, and one that I continue to have with a variety of people across the sort of educational spectrum, and traditional to progressive, whatever. Where do you see, or how do you see the role of something like inquiry in education and in the vision for education as you see it?
It's a good question, and I know that inquiry is one particular passion of yours and one thing that you care a lot about. One thing that I would say in terms of inquiry is I think that people at any stage of learning can use inquiry. But what will happen is when you have people who do not have as large of a base of knowledge, as large of a base of understanding to inquire from, the directions their inquiry will take them will often look like sort of inefficiently climbing to the next level of knowledge that a lot of other people have already figured out. So, you could picture someone learning all of mathematics via an inquiry sort of approach, where they're slowly and laboriously re-deriving everything that people for thousands of years have figured out, and therefore never reaching the point where they're able to contribute interesting insights in meaningful ways because they are working so hard to reinvent the wheel. So the way I would view inquiry is, first of all, inquiry is and should be seen as a skill in and of itself. Like, there are going to be better and worse ways to inquire, more effective and less effective ways to do that, and it is worth understanding the mechanisms of it and teaching that as a skill. Second of all, I would say inquiry is something that people at any level can do, and something that can and will be useful at times and in places for people at any level. And third off, I would say that inquiry is not the most effective way to climb up a tower of skill, to climb up any given tower of skill. And when your specific objective is make someone more skilled at this specific thing, inquiry is generally not going to be the thing that gets them towards the top fastest. So when you're optimizing towards that, you're usually going to want to use other techniques.
Right, and I would agree with all of that. I mean, you talked about effectiveness. I think you mentioned efficiency, and efficiency, I think, is a really key term here, really key piece of that puzzle. And I talk about that in our work when we work with teachers on inquiry is like, all right, if you want efficiency, and to me, it's all about what outcomes you're after, that then helps you align your instructional approach. And inquiry is often not very efficient in getting, especially, in the land of things like math, and I certainly wouldn't recommend using inquiry for teaching of reading. Quite the opposite. So finding the right approach, but then, like, some of education is not math, right? Some of education is not some of those concrete things, that knowledge that has been discovered already, but it's something like, as a social studies teacher, and I was just talking with an author and history teacher in Australia about teaching of history in the secondary level, and I taught social studies and psychology as well. So, a question like, or thinking through the ideas of separation of powers, or balance and checks and balances, right? And using an inquiry process that might be unpacking and exploring whether or not the executive branch has more power right now than they should, or some version of that, right? To me, that open-endedness is where an inquiry process can be really helpful, and mixed with that guided instruction and direct instruction, so that they're not discovering all of that on their own. So one of the things that I have found is that there's a conversation that tends to happen on science and learning stuff that tends to stay, it's like almost always about math and science and those kinds of hard sciences kinds of things. And then when we get into like humanities or social studies, history, government, those kinds of bigger open-ended kinds of questions, certainly with lots of knowledge, that it becomes maybe apparent that, like I can't imagine doing interleaving in a history class. I mean, you could, I suppose, but like we're not necessarily asking or wanting, or maybe you disagree with this, students to memorize all of the things in history, right? We want them to have an overall idea and some understanding of chronology and big kinds of things, but not all the sort of granular details committed to memory like we would want them to do in math.
Yeah, it's a good question and a good frame and a good thing to look at with it. And look, my own focus at present certainly is law, which is pretty far from that math, science, all of that, and is much more in this sort of history, humanities domain. And when you're looking at it in law, you have the way instruction typically works in law, right, is a lot of it's trying to teach people to think like a lawyer and trying to teach people to approach things like that, while at the same time getting them well acquainted with a specific body of doctrine and a specific body of, here is the way this field of law works. Here are the relevant precedents, here are the relevant decisions, here are the relevant things like that. And what I would say is, in any given subject, in any given classroom, in history, you're not necessarily going to want a student to memorize all of these names and dates and memorize all of these really, really specific granular details. However, there will be specific areas of knowledge that if they want to engage intelligently with, and if they want to produce genuine value in this area of focus with it, there will be a lot of granular relevant information that they should be acquainted with. That is, if you're looking at someone and going to say, like, this person is an expert in this domain of history, this person is someone who is able to produce relevant and useful and meaningful thoughts in this area of history, there's a lot of background knowledge that they will want to pick up with that. So what I would say is, in any subject, including these humanities ones, you should be able to drill in and say, these are the specific concrete things I want people to be able to understand about this, that if they are, and the interesting thing about history is it's so big, so massive, and so constructed by humans, in the sense of it's not something like math where it's this very hierarchical discipline where you have skills building on skills building on skills. It's a very broad discipline where you could have someone, a 14-year-old could drill in and become one of the world's foremost experts on this very specific niche subtopic of history, sure, because it's just that broad. Anyway, so when you're looking at something like history, there will be specific skills, specific research skills, so forth, things that they would be developing, a specific body of knowledge that you would be trying to convey to them. And then, yes, layered on top of that, you would have some degree of inquiry in the sense of what do you think of this? What do you do about this? I would say the way I conceive some of that inquiry stuff, in terms of like where does it fit into history, so forth, is first of all, it's often trickier to really concretely develop people's skills in that. And I would say that if someone is serious about inquiry, I think they should be serious about understanding to what extent can we concretely develop people's skills in this? To what extent, when we are teaching this, are people actually actively becoming better at this? Can we measure this? Can we demonstrate that they are becoming better at this inquiry? Versus, are we just providing a platform where people who are already by default good at this will be, flexing it a little bit? But more broadly, I would say you want to be drilling into this doctrine, drilling into the specifics, drilling into how much do these people need to know to become genuinely, approaching expertise in this subject, progressing expertise in this subject, and then on the margins, and particularly for fun and for flexing their minds and so forth, give them some practice with that inquiry side of things.
Well, I don't want to get lost in the weeds of inquiry versus direct instruction and all of that, although it's something that I think is important. I want to kind of return to the vision and the work that you're envisioning for Center for Educational Progress. So what are the kinds of specific things that you as an organization are hoping to engage in to get to some of the goals? As I'm looking at the Substack piece, and we'll link to this, is we're ready to try the policies that education schools don't like. Direct instruction works, acceleration works, ability grouping works, aristocratic tutoring works, so that pursuit of excellence. So those are the outcomes, or at least some of the outcomes broadly that you're after. What are the things that you're anticipating you will do to get those things, I guess, back in schools?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, education is decentralized by design, and that makes any specific advocacy a very complicated, multi-headed, multifaceted beast. So our goal is really, and we're just starting out here, so I'm not going to sit and say, I have a comprehensive 500-point plan of this is how we will accomplish every part of it. But some specific concrete things we'll be looking at. We want to really put effort into mapping out what the policies on acceleration, advanced education, things like that look like in a concrete way in these different domains, in these different states. Which areas, for example, have selective schools like Stuyvesant, like Thomas Jefferson High School? Which areas do not have free options with that? In other words, which areas could you honestly say the best public school experience is comparable to the best private school experience here? This is a place where students who are on the top end of this distribution or looking for the most challenge could reliably use public school, versus this is an area where private school students would just simply have an advantage in this place over public school students. And then look for concrete ways, like, is there some place where it would be useful to have a selective school that there isn't one? Or where are the areas that specifically, like, say, gifted programs, for example, are being dismantled, are being removed? And what specific narrow levers can we pull to, A, draw attention to that, B, look for alternatives to dismantling them? What are the specific proposals we can make with that? What are areas where this topic area has just generally been neglected, where we could go in and with some quick advocacy, raise the salience of these topics in that area and hand them some easy policy wins in terms of, here are some better ways to group, here are some better ways to accelerate, here are areas where you might be willing to use the best practices, you just haven't really thought of them, and look for things like that. In terms of funding, right now, say on a national level, it's interesting because right now the Department of Education is being pretty thoroughly dismantled. So a lot of things that maybe we would be looking at saying on a national level under the last admin, we don't really have the chance to do that sort of thing under this admin, but still looking and saying, say on a national level, there was only one policy on the national level, the Javits Gifted and Talented program, that was really targeted towards the question of acceleration, or the question of excellence in schools, and it contained only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the federal budget. So under an administration that was serious about, federal involvement in education, we'd be asking, what are some productive, effective programs that theoretically we could do if someone was excellence-oriented, say this is something that you could throw money at and this would be useful. That's another thing that we'd be looking at on that level. But basically, the general scope of it is looking for other meaningful levers on all the levels that of this, labyrinth and space of education policy that would orient people towards excellence and orient people towards grouping more effectively, accelerating more effectively, things like that. In addition to all of that, in terms of like working with the system as it is, what we'll be working to do is identify the specific curricula and the specific domains that are most aligned with our vision. So for example, in mathematics education, art of problem solving is a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant curriculum for mathematics that basically does everything we would hope to see in a mathematics curriculum. So if we could compile a full set of these are the things that really do what we would want to do with that, ultimately we'd be able to look into, can we start schools that use these things and that use our ideal grouping techniques? And if we can't start schools that do that, if we can't start schools that use our ideal curricular, ideal grouping techniques, so forth, what are the specific policy barriers that we would need to tear down, or what are the specific areas of knowledge that we would need to build before we feel confident in doing that? And we'll target all of those.
You said art of problem solving?
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that program? And let me put a little meat on that bone, because I'm in the middle of a book for an upcoming podcast, and I'm curious if you are aware of this program and how much you might know about it, because it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on it. The Modern Classroom Project, that is really about sort of using videos, instruction, digitized direct instruction, and then that allows for in-class sort of one-on-one kinds of, or small group kinds of coaching. So to the extent that you're aware of that, I'd be interested to hear any thoughts you have on that. But regardless, I'm curious to know more about the art of problem solving.
Yeah, so I can't speak directly to the Modern Classroom Project. It's something that I haven't looked closely at yet.
Okay.
But art of problem solving is really a fascinating model of exactly what to do right from my angle in education. So it was founded a couple of decades ago when Richard, I might butcher his last name, but Richard Drucksmith looked around and wanted to start a mathematics competition, and felt like the average level of students, that these students who were ostensibly smart in math, good at math, whatever, the average level of these students was simply nowhere near what he wanted to do to make this mathematics competition happen. So he sat down and started asking, well, what if I were designing a curriculum from scratch for these top end students? What would that curriculum look like? What would a really, really effective competition-focused math curriculum look like? And so he and the people with him put in years and years of work of designing this really thorough, thoughtful, careful, like competition-oriented curriculum for the way they usually say it's like, say, the top 5% or so of students in math are the ones who would really find a lot of benefit from it, but available to all students, and they can see how they go with it. But that really drills into math on a more complex, a deeper, and a more thorough level than you would get in regular elementary school, middle school, high school classrooms. And they made a fairly complete curriculum with all of that. Goes through every subject that is covered in schools, but in a lot more depth, with a lot more complexity, with a lot more focus on problem solving. They created both a full curriculum in terms of textbooks and in terms of like online tools. They have an online tool called Alchemist that lets students run through these problems and develop their skills and all of that. They build all of this out with an eye towards math competitions, with an eye towards just really developing student skills in this. Build a community around it. And at this point, it is the curriculum used, for example, by virtually every International Mathematics Olympiad participant will wind up using this curriculum. And they use it because it is straightforwardly better, more complete, more comprehensive than other curricula at training students on these specific skills and doing that effectively.
It's funny because I thought that sounded familiar, and while you were talking, I looked, and I actually talked with Richard in February of 2022 on our podcast, developing. It's episode 281, back when we were still named Teach Thought Professional Development. So, episode 281, developing potential through problem solving. If you want to listen to Richard and learn more, like you said that, and I thought that sounds familiar to me. But one of the things that, as I was looking at their website, that they talk about on the website, or they mention pretty prominently, is the idea of critical thinking, which is something that I'm curious to hear your sort of take on, and how you think about critical thinking and teaching critical thinking and measuring critical thinking, because I get pushback sometimes on social media from folks who I would say are pretty aligned with science of learning kinds of mindsets, who say, critical thinking is a nonsense concept. It's not something we can teach. We can't measure it. How can we, if we can't measure it, then, it's just sort of nonsense. All these sort of different versions of it. I certainly disagree. And I think we can measure it, although it's not as easily quantifiable as, do you know what 2 + 2 is? So how do you think about critical thinking, I guess, as a concept and teaching it and measuring it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And my sort of, I'm not sure if it's a cynical or realist, what have you, answer to it, but my response is effectively that I think that the specific mechanics of what they're doing are a lot more compelling for me to look at than the whatever quote unquote buzzwords they might use to describe it, in the sense of when they're talking about critical thinking, whatever, and you're saying, can this be measured, anything like that, I can go in and I can immediately start working on their problem sets, and I can figure out, can I do this problem or can I not do this problem? You can send a student into these problems, and math is nice in that way. You can send them in and say, do you understand this? Do you not understand this? If you do not understand this, why don't you? What are the specific gaps that you have that will help you understand this, whatever. And so when they're going through everything, because they're constantly having students do these worked examples, do these problems, work up through these problem sets, they can pretty quickly and pretty immediately understand where's the student's level of knowledge at with mathematics, where are the gaps, where are the things that they do understand, what don't they understand, what problems are they capable of, what problems aren't they capable of. And so they have creative problems with that, and they have problems that do stretch students' minds in interesting ways and stretch students' minds in unusual ways. But fundamentally, it's this very data-driven and very concrete frame where they constantly have tremendous amounts of data on, here's exactly what the student knows, here's exactly the extent to which they are capable of this or not capable of this, and would constantly be able to refine and iterate and say, well, what is the specific narrow skill that's needed for this, or what's the broad frame that this student is missing.
Yeah, well, again, I'm looking at the website, and it's just a little bit amusing to me. Not anything that you said, but again, it says critical thinking. Students focus on advanced problem solving and conceptual understanding, not rote memorization. Which is, that rote memorization is one of those things that gets argued about on social media and other places between sort of progressive and traditional educators. Like. It just is sort of interesting that that art of problem solving, that they're using that language, and again, we could unpack that maybe in a different podcast.
I absolutely I agree, it is interesting, and this is one reason why I say that, like, if you're leaning between progressive, traditionalist, whatever, I would say I come down on the quote-unquote traditionalist side in a lot of ways. With that, I also think that dichotomy is inherently somewhat limiting and somewhat misleading towards the things that I'm focusing on, in the sense of, if I was just coming in and saying, I want traditionalism to win out over progressivism, yada, 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 then I wouldn't have needed to start a whole new thing. I would just jump on board these guys and be like, this is right, this is everything. I'm really, looking to forge this pragmatic synthesis approach towards, here are the things that concretely have given the best results in the domains that I care about, and whatever words people use to describe them, whatever frames people use to describe them, whatever. I just want to understand these underlying mechanics of this is effectively accomplishing these goals, and here's why.
Yeah, I'm on board with, and we're going to continue to have conversations, some specifically on trying to get away from some of this dichotomous us versus them thinking, because I think it's unproductive. It is that, as you mentioned, I think pragmatic synthesis. So I just have to ask, because I'm imagining people will ask you this, and maybe already have asked you this, in a project like this, which is, highly aspirational. A couple things. One, I wish I had a nickel for every time I heard somebody say they're going to, sort of reimagine education. And it's not exactly what you're saying, but, it's big aspirations, right? It's a big,
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna change education, or at least that's the goal. So, what makes this project different? Also, some people will. I mean, they're not privy to the video. You said you're, studying law. I think you're not haven't been a teacher that I'm aware of. Correct me if I'm wrong. You haven't. You're relatively young, I think, from all of the visual cues I'm getting. So I'm imagining, you're asking for funding, or suggesting policies or advocating for this, and people are saying, yeah, but just another big initiative or project with high aspirations. And who are you to tell us why and what we should be doing with education? So how do you anticipate countering those kinds of questions?
Absolutely. Those are fantastic questions, and those are things that I think that absolutely I need to be prepared to face down and answer honestly and frankly. I would say part of it is that a lot of our goal, we want to interact with specific districts, and we want to interact with specific spaces and everything. Parts of it are simply planting a flag in the ground saying, here's what we want, who also wants these things, and then figuring out how to work with those people. So where I'm coming in and looking is essentially I'm saying, I recognize that I'm young. I recognize that I'm inexperienced. If someone was doing the things that I wanted people to be doing, then I would have joined on with them, and I would have just hitched my wagon to someone more experienced and more capable of doing these things. As it is, I can essentially just say, this is the space I'm trying to occupy, and who will occupy it with me. With that, it's in the group that I'm putting together and in the space of people, I have direct mentorship and direct advice from someone who's founded a chain of more than 100 Montessori schools. I have a dean of a school who I work closely with. I have a lot of instructors, a lot of teachers, a lot of people who do have these specific concrete stakes in the establishments, admins, some teachers, so forth, people who are in line with this vision. And I personally don't have a lot of direct experience in teaching. I was a substitute teacher for about 6 months, which obviously is nothing in terms of actually understanding the internal workings of the system with teaching. But what I'm coming in and saying is not nearly as much, hey, teachers, you are doing your jobs wrong, and you personally are, screwing this up or this up or this up. I'm really focused a lot more on the administrative level, on the policy level, and on the questions of, before we even get into the classroom, which areas are we doing wrong in terms of education, schools, so forth. Where are the flaws there? And I don't think you need to be a teacher to look at these administrative levels and look at these policy levels and look at these levers and say, these things are far from my ideal. If you can, you can look and you can say, which goal are these people optimizing towards? Which goal am I optimizing towards? Do we share these same baseline ideals, or are we having a dispute over ideals? And I would say, if someone doesn't share these same baseline ideals with me, if they're not interested in this education as a pursuit of excellence thing, then that gap in ideals is going to be a lot more relevant than a gap in credentials in terms of understanding things. More broadly, in terms of why people should trust me, why people should care, why people should envision these things, I would say that a lot of times there are areas where experience is useful. There are areas where working within a system and forging a deep understanding of it from the inside are useful, and there are areas where outsiders can come in and do come in and try to take things in a different direction, where the outsiders, if someone can introduce a new paradigm, or if someone can work in a way that a system isn't optimized towards, if you can gather a group of people together optimizing in a different direction than something that a system has focused on for a while, then it can act as an interesting sort of counterweight that simply zeroes in on a lot of things that others aren't. So my basic case, in other words, is I believe that I am going to be focusing in on and optimizing towards a few areas that a lot of people, some people have been pushing for a long while. If you look at the acceleration research, everyone who has researched acceleration in schools will be saying the same things that I'm saying about it, that it works, that it's effective, that it's not used anywhere near enough. All of these researchers that are focused on these students, Maraka Gross, the SPY guys, things like that, they're all going to be focused on these things, and they're saying this matters. Expertise research, things like that, those guys will all be saying that stuff works. So what we're trying to do is pull together a few areas of research and a few areas of focus from people who are legitimately experts in their fields and who have spent their lifetime studying these things, and say, how can we properly apply these, and what are the most effective ways we can apply these? In terms of actual concrete impact, and in terms of so many bright-eyed reformers going in and saying we can do all of these things and coming face to face with this whole creaking system, that's a real thing. And I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and say, yeah, absolutely, we're confident that we will tame the beast of American education and forge our way through things and direct things exactly in our way. What I will say is there are specific things that I want to accomplish at every level of education, and I am going to take wins where I can get them, any place I can find them. If there's a lever I can pull that gets me closer to what I want to accomplish, I will pull that lever and I will be grateful for it. If there is a social, cultural, any of that that I can do, I will do it. Like, I'm not coming in naive thinking, yeah, I'll take on the whole system and win, transform everything in a moment. What I am saying is that I think that there are going to be some areas of low-hanging fruit and going to be some specific narrow areas where people can and should be persuaded. And those are the areas I'll be looking at while trying to build up an ecosystem of people who care about and think about and focus on the same things I do. And I'll see where it leads. Like, if it leads to this dramatic, large-scale, this all works and everything is awesome, fantastic. If we need to iterate, if we need to change, if we need to push something in a different way, we'll do that. And if ultimately we have to throw our hands up and say, oh, it's all useless and everything, I don't anticipate that happening. I think there will always be productive things to do, but the reality is education is complicated. We recognize it's complicated, and we'll just do what we can.
And you have a partner in this. As we sort of wrap up here, I want to give you an opportunity to kind of share links and all that kind of thing, but I assume you would. It's worth mentioning. Is it Lillian Tara?
Yeah, Lillian Tara.
And what is her background and contribution?
Yeah, so Lillian is going to handle a lot of the operations side of things, coordinating, organizing a lot of things, in addition to contributing some of the writing and some of the focus to it. She just graduated from Harvard Education School, and she, not to put words in her mouth, but she basically thinks Harvard Education School is useless towards the things she actually cares about. And so on the one hand, she has a credential from a pretty respected, recognized institution. And on the other hand, what drew us together was a shared conviction that that system of credentialing and the specific things that they focus on and the specific ways they focus on those things is kind of bad. So what she contributes is a lot of energy, a lot of capacity in terms of organizing and understanding, what needs to be done, what can be done on a systemic level, and a lot of passion in terms of desperately wanting to see something better than what she has built. And, she's younger than me. She's in her early 20s, and really prioritized pushing through the school system as fast as possible while having a lot of specific frustrations with it that she wants to see resolved. And she is, she's read the same things I have, has looked into the same things I have, and come to much the same conclusions I have about them. And so we saw an area where we could collaborate and productively build something meaningful together.
Okay, well, that's probably a good place to wrap up. And again, what are the places that people should find your work? What do you want them to do? I know you have a Substack, and there you have a place where they can sign up for a volunteer form, and you have a Discord server, and so on and so forth. But now's the place to put all those things in.
Absolutely. You can follow me personally on Twitter at Trace Woodgrains, and can find my personal writing at tracingwoodgrains.com. In terms of the Center for Educational Progress, we're going to put our outward focused writing will be at educationprogress.org, and there you can hop in, join our Discord and contribute, offer to volunteer, so forth. We'll on Twitter at Center for Ed Prog on Twitter. And those are the main two spots that you can find specifically at Center for Education Progress right now. We are just getting started up. We are very excited to do so, and we'll see where it all goes.
Well, Jack, I appreciate the time and the conversation. Godspeed in making the changes. There's, I think, a lot that I agree with and overlap in how we think about education. Certainly some things that maybe we think differently about, but that's okay. But as always, I hope folks find this helpful.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.